what do you see at the time?
Right. I know a lot's been made out of the fact that he was supposedly blind and helpless, and that's certainly not the way that I viewed it that night. I believe that he could see a lot more than he was letting on, certainly. And if you notice, when he's walking around the holding cell, he's not bumping into walls. He's able to find the door. He's able to find the window that's on the door, which is actually pretty small. He's able to find the sink whenever he wants it. He's able to find the bench at his leisure. And certainly he's wandering around pacing, but he's not bumping into things, and he could see a lot better than what that depicts in that video. And especially with it being shot from up above, if you're squinting or if you're blinking or whatever, that video is not going to catch somebody's eyes in that configuration, if that makes sense.
Okay, so despite the fact he'd been maced, by that point, which is quite a while after he's been maced, it was your impression that he was recovering just fine.
Yes, I thought he was recovering fine. As a matter of fact, once again, he told me that he was ready to go on with the booking procedure, which also tells me that he's recovering fine. I mean, by his own words, okay, I'm ready to go on. I mean, that tells me he's recovering.
Okay. Doesn't mean he's perfect. He could still be uncomfortable, but it also is not going to stop him from fighting, right?
That's correct, nor did it at the scene.
So you put him in the holding cell for the first time. You get him settled, and you did grab the toilet paper, didn't you?
Yes, I took the toilet paper out because it's been my experience that, I hate to say that you have to earn the right to it, but you certainly don't start off with it in there. If somebody needs to go to the bathroom, you know, I check on my prisoners often, I make sure of that, but somebody that was as uncooperative as him, I didn't want him to stuff the toilet and flood it. I've certainly had that experience where I didn't see toilet paper in there, or they've taken their shirt off and plugged the toilet, and we've had 2 inches of water flowing in the holding cell, and then we've had to fight the individual in 2 inches of water. So you don't start off with toilet paper in the cell.
And what happened next?
At that point, I can't remember now if he beat on the holding cell first or if he started asking for water first. And he tried the sink, and he wasn't getting any water. And I mean, I've been there 18 years. I certainly don't remember a time when the sinks worked there.
In any of the cells?
Not to my recollection. I mean, certainly, I guess they could have, but I don't recall that. And other holding cells, I know a lot's been made out of, I could have put him in another holding cell. Not all holding cells even had a toilet or a sink. Certainly not. And there's 2 holding cells at the Columbia Police Department that are actually secure cells. They all have steel doors. Only 2 have steel latches and a steel lock. The others have aluminum. And actually, if you shut the aluminum doors with the bars shut in the shut configuration, you'll actually bend the aluminum by just shutting the doors. They have drywall ceilings that can be punched out and give access upstairs. So it's just not a secure facility. So as far as the latches, I have seen prisoners bend them. I have seen prisoners break the actual lock mechanisms to the point where we've had to get the fire department down and break into the holding cell to get somebody out, which can be a dangerous situation. If they beat hard enough to do damage there, they could have hurt themselves. I've also witnessed somebody take the air vent out of the roof, or I guess sidewall up towards the roof, and beat out the rectangle-shaped window and bust it out while officers were waiting outside. So there's a lot, and very cunning prisoners, certainly maybe somebody that's been incarcerated for a while, can do to the holding cells.
The point, though, is that it was common knowledge around the police department that if you beat on the holding cell doors, there's a decent chance you're going to bend the latch.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and we heard some testimony earlier about the difference between the latch and the big key lock. And well, why don't you just use the key lock?
Again, I've seen both the latches, which is basically just almost imagining a 1-inch strip of steel, 2 of those about 15 inches long. I've seen them bent, but the actual locking mechanism, which is about this big around, that takes your standard jail key, which is huge. I've actually witnessed them being destroyed to the point where we had to get fire department down. So certainly those locks that are supposed to defuse that can be damaged as well.
Okay. Was it the practice to use the big locks?
Usually if you had someone for some indicator, yes, you could use it. It was not always used. I would almost say that 99.9% of the time it was not.
Not just by you, but by everybody?
Oh, by everybody, certainly.
Okay. So, you've put him in for the first time, he starts banging on the door, and what happens?
I went over and instructed him that we did not allow people to beat on the holding cell doors. He was asking questions about the water, and I simply told him that the water did not work and that we did not have any water accessible, that he needed time and air and to fan himself, and I went through a great deal of explanation, but I finished with, you cannot beat on the holding cell door or you'll be placed on the ring behind you on the floor. It's very uncomfortable. I tell everybody that. I think sometimes that people think just because they're ringed that, okay, oh well, but it's pretty uncomfortable to sit there, ringed to the wall. And so I always do a good job of telling them exactly what's going to happen if they don't stop their behavior.
Did you tell him to drink out of the toilet?
No, that is certainly absolutely misconstrued from what I said.
What'd you actually tell him?
He was telling me that he wanted water, turn on the water, and I said, sir, I'm sorry, there's no water in the holding cell. And he started back into that rant. I said, the only water in the holding cell is that in the toilet. And the reason that I said that is because on 2 prior occasions, I have seen what I saw to be a more hardened criminal, certainly somebody that I would put in Mr. Baker's shoes, use the toilet upon their entry into the cell to defuse mace. Not after they had been washed out, certainly, but somebody had placed them in there suffering the effects of mace. They dropped to their knees, they stuck their head in there as if it was a shower, washed themselves up, stood up, and when we offered them a decontamination wipe, they said, no thanks, I'm good. And I had seen that on 2 prior occasions. The other thing that I kind of maybe thought is that if he is truly hurting that bad, and if my assumptions were right about him being in the penitentiary, we have all kinds of data that says that, people in the penitentiaries make everything from coffee to hooch or booze, if you will, out of the toilet water in their cells. So if he was truly hurting that bad, I wanted to give him that option of saying, that there it is. But certainly, as a matter of fact, his response was something to the effect that he was not using that, and I said, I don't blame you. That was my response back to him. I don't blame you, I wouldn't do it either. That was my response back.
And so, what happened next?
At that point, I shut the door and I can't remember if we went in the hallway at that point or back into the booking area. But it was pretty well known that he was going to beat on the holding cell door again. I mean, it was just a matter of time given his behavior.
At this point, you've got Officer Kreitz and Officer Hibbler with you, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And on the video that we watched earlier, Officer Hibbler comes in a little after you and Kreitz, and he's got his own prisoner, right?
Correct. He was there just as, I believe, Mr. Baker started hitting on the door.
Okay. And his prisoner went in one of the other holding cells, right?
Yes.
And so the expectation is Mr. Baker is going to continue to pound on the door. And so what did the 3 of you do?
Well, we went to confront him about the banging of the door. We stayed out of sight because we didn't want to stand in front of the window and antagonize him or anything like that. We stayed over to the side where we were out of sight and out of hearing and just waited. Again, you kind of get a feel for what a prisoner's going to do, and he was certainly escalating back up. And so we knew it was just a matter of time until he beat on the door again and would have to be restrained on the ring.
And did that in fact occur? You started beating on the door again?
Yes.
And what did you all do?
We went back to the door. I waited, I think, a few seconds and then opened the door and asked Mr. Baker to have a seat at the back of the holding cell so that I could place him on the ring.
What was his response?
If the proceedings will permit me, his answer was, fuck you.
And what did you do?
At that point, I used verbal judo, which I was a big fan of at the time for situations just like this, because at the point where you explain to him, and I'll give you the phrase that I used in a moment, it gives you an insight into what their mind or capability or thought process is. And I always do it the same way anytime I'm going to use physical force, whether it's to ask somebody to get in or out of the car or to step up on the curb or in your general duties. This is one of the things that I always use because at the point where you're getting ready to use force, it's important that not only everybody around you know that this is going to happen, however, it's kind of like their last opportunity. And the phrase that I used was, "Sir, is there anything that I can say or do to make you peacefully have a seat at the back of the holding cell without using physical force against you?"
And that's part of the verbal judo training, true?
That is correct.
And part of the training is that it's a technique of last resort, yes?
That is correct. Again, it places everybody on alert around you. Other officers know if they're busy doing something or whatever, and they hear that phrase, they know that something is getting ready to go down. It also certainly lends itself to you have done everything that you can do at that point, and you've asked them politely, and if they give you a negative response, you're basically left with no other recourse except to use physical force against them. It's part of the question to them.
What was his response to you when you used verbal judo?
I believe it was "fuck you" again.
Now, before we actually talk about the force that you applied, tell me this. Why? Why did it matter to go in and put this guy on there?
Well, it was certainly the way that we had done things for the 18 years that I had been there. There's, like I said, a chance that he could be injured, certainly a chance that property damage could have happened to the rings at the holding cell, or I'm sorry, not the rings, but the bars and the locks of the holding cell. Again, I've seen damage done to the windows there and such. It was our protocol, it was our policy, and it's just part of your job is to go into situations like that and deal with them.
Well, we heard a bunch of testimony about it's unnecessary. Just wait. Who cares?
I can only be as honest as I possibly can and tell you that that's one of the most ridiculous statements that I've ever heard in my life. If you use that on the street with a homicide suspect, say, "Oh my gosh, he's killed 5 people, he might kill me." Well, why do you have police departments? And why do you have holding cells? And why do you have policies that say to put somebody on the ring, if they do this, then put them there? I mean, it makes no sense.
Okay. Well, that's an extreme example, but my question is, why wouldn't you just ignore it? Why wouldn't you just wait? It's been described by the chief of police as totally unnecessary. So why was everybody doing it?
I have no idea. I really don't have any idea. That's as foreign a concept to me as I've ever heard.
Is it foreign to you because that's what your FTO has always told you to do?
Yes.
Your field training officer back when you started?
Yes.
That's what your training officers have always told you to do?
Yes.
That's what your supervisors have always told you to do?
Yes.
When somebody beats on the door, it doesn't matter what's going on or why, they go on the ring.
That's correct.
And so the door is now open. Mr. Baker has refused to cooperatively go have a seat. And what happens?
At that point, I noticed that Mr. Baker was coming forward in the cell. Certainly, he wasn't running forward, but he was working his way forward. Generally, in our use of force training, we're told to pick a move that we feel most comfortable with and use that move to our 100% capabilities. The reason for that is that it lessens the chances of any follow-up moves being necessary. In other words, if I do one strike that I feel comfortable with and it totally incapacitates the subject, then there's no need to have multiple strikes or multiple opportunities for either one of us to get hurt. My normal move that I would have used in that situation was a leg sweep. However, with his proximity to the door and the toilet, I did not feel like that I had enough room to get in there and do a leg sweep. I really felt that he would hit his head on the toilet or the bed that was there if I would have done that. So I opted for my secondary option, which was to push the subject down.
And what was your intent in doing it?
Just to push him over on his butt or his back and then to take him over to the holding cell ring and cuff him to the ring.
Now, why did you feel that even you described it as a pretty brutal push. Why did you feel that a push was necessary with this guy?
I felt like it was the quickest way to get him to the ground where we could better deal with him. Not all three of us could fit through the door at the same time. Most times when officers or multiple officers engage somebody in a fight, a lot of times we each take an arm, and the very first thing that happens is that we try to do the old wishbone thing, and we're pulling opposite directions, and we're actually fighting with ourselves more than with the combatant. So I felt like that it was the fastest way to get him on the ground and then take him over to the ring.
Do you recall back in maybe the early 2000s attending any department training about taking people down in a holding cell?
I remember going to that training, and I remember a little bit about it. Certainly not extremely well versed, but some.
And in essence, that training was the first guy through the door bull rushes him and drives him into the back wall, wasn't it?
That is correct.
But in this instance, you would normally go to a leg sweep, but you felt like the confines were too tight, so you figured you're going to push him over and he's just going to go down on his butt or on his back, right?
That's correct.
And once that's occurred, the other two guys will have had time to get in. You can wrap him up and get him over to the ring.
Yes. Basically, exactly what we did after the subject had hit the wall.
So the only thing that happened different from the way you envisioned it was, instead of just going straight backwards down on his butt, he went backwards into the back wall.
That's correct.
Okay. So what happened after? Well, I'm sorry, let me stop and back up. When you use force against someone, do you go 25%?
No, sir.
Do you go 50%?
No, sir.
Do you go 75%?
No, sir.
What do you do?
We're taught that if you have the reason to use force, or if you feel that you have the reason to use force, you're to use, again, whatever move you deem it necessary to your 100% maximum in whatever move that is, whether it's a baton strike, a knee strike, a punch to the face, whatever you deem necessary, you are to use that to 100%.
It doesn't matter how big you are, how strong you are. The principles of defensive tactics and force tactics is you deliver 100%, right?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, every time that I was in training, I always asked that for clarification because I am, a weightlifter and a decent-sized guy. I always made that clear that in a question to our head trainer or whoever was doing the training, that applies to everybody across the board, not size related or anything like that. It's 100%. And that was always given back to me as yes.
So you deliver to the push to Mr. Baker. He goes backwards. You guys get him cuffed up to the ring, and then what happens next?
At that point, we withdrew to outside the holding cell, and it was as I was shutting the door that I realized that I had some blood on my arm. I had been in a fight 2 weeks before, and it was a pretty substantial fight with a much smaller individual, but I had some pretty serious cuts to my elbows. I figured that I had broken open one of my abrasions and that it was my blood. So I asked one of the officers nearby to check my arm because I had a smear of blood here on my tricep. So I asked him to look and make sure, or to see if it was my blood or if I'd broken open one of my scabs or whatever. It was at that point that Officer Kreitz took a look at me and said that he didn't think that it was my blood. So instead of tending to my own wounds, we went right back in the holding cell and checked on Mr. Baker.
And what did you find?
I found about a 1-inch cut on the back of his head. I think at that point I saw about 1 drop of blood on the floor of the holding cell. I actually wasn't sure at first if it was more of a scratch or if it was a cut, and I actually used my fingers to kind of check it, and it was a cut. So at that point we exited and called for medics.
What was Mr. Baker doing at that time?
He was still threatening to kill me. He never lost consciousness as it was depicted earlier. He continued to say that I did not deserve to live or live around people. He threatened to kill me, he threatened to find me afterwards, and kill me. And that rhetoric never, ever stopped the entire time, that from the push on, once we got him cuffed, he never stopped that rhetoric the entire rest of the night.
So you three did leave the cell, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And you went out and Hibbler, Officer Hibbler, tried to get a hold of Joint Communications, true?
Yes, the majority of the time, our portable radios that we spoke about earlier, they do not work inside the police department the majority of the time. So you're forced to use the phones or cell phones or whatever. So Officer Hibbler began calling the medics. I heard him calling the medics. I heard him frustrated with calling the medics through Joint Communications. And then I made the suggestion of calling the front desk, which he then tried, and I believe he was frustrated because it took him a little bit to get a hold of them.
But you absolutely called for a medic.
Most definitely, we called for a medic.
Were you ever trained, told, read somewhere that if a prisoner was injured, you're supposed to stay in the cell and watch him?
No, I've never heard that or been told that at all.
Okay. And why didn't you go back and look at him, watch him in the cell?
Especially with the rhetoric that, again, he was displaying, where he was continually threatening me and us, again, saying he was going to kill me. I felt like that being back in his presence was going to prolong that, was going to make it so that it was even a more adversarial situation. He might have begun to spit on me or kick at me or whatever, and at that point we would have been forced to either use more force or just basically antagonizing him. I've certainly seen people seated on the ring that have sat there and beat their heads against the concrete behind them to the point where we had to secure a helmet on them to keep them from that. So I didn't want to go and antagonize him further by sitting there. I knew somebody at the front desk was watching him, and normally the medics are really quick. Sometimes if they're out on call, sometimes they're there within seconds. This certainly was not your average wait for the medics.
And do you have any understanding of why it took the medic 11, 12 minutes to get there?
Well, I think at first it was because it took a while to get the call out through Joint Communications and the front desk, but then after that, it was a very busy night, and all of the medics were on call someplace else.
And Chief Burton says it was your responsibility to wait out there for the medic.
I've never heard that before. The way that it normally works is you wait in the booking room, booking area. About 75 to 80% of the times, well, let me back up. 100% of the times that I'm aware of, there will be Joint Communication will be paging the building, where the front desk will page the building and say that the medics are outside, let them in. About 75 to 85% of the time, they come in the same booking area Sally Port door that we did with Mr. Baker. However, I've had them come in through the Joint Communications door up on the roof of the building because there wasn't parking in the garage. I've had them come in off of Walnut Street entrance. I've had them come in the main lobby entrance, and I've had them come in through the sergeant's office entrance. So to say that I was supposed to wait for them someplace, I had no idea where that would be. I mean, I had no idea. We were in the sergeant's office and we were waiting for the medics to arrive, certainly.
Okay. And he did arrive, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And what happened after he arrived?
He made 3 different attempts to treat Mr. Baker and look at Mr. Baker. However, Mr. Baker was so uncooperative with him that he actually picked up his stuff to leave on 3 separate occasions before he actually was able to take a look at Mr. Baker.
Have you ever had any training other than on use of force or just general policy training about how to avoid being abusive or improperly treating a prisoner?
No, I have not.
Okay. Do you have any belief in your heart that you abused Mr. Baker?
No, sir.
Do you have any belief in your heart that you treated Mr. Baker improperly because you didn't sit there and watch him?
No, I've never even heard that before. I don't have any idea like why that would be important. Again, we have a monitor, that's why the cameras are there. We have somebody at the front desk to monitor that. I've never heard that before.
And you make a comment on the video that somebody else is gonna have to do your blue team. What are you talking about there?
Blue team is a form that anytime that you use a use of force type situation, it's essentially an extra form. When Chief Burton came, he made it a more elaborate situation to do a use of force form, and it's quite extensive, and it's a whole computer program on itself, and it does not coincide with the other 2 or 3 computer systems at the police department. So you have to basically build everyone all over again, even if they're in one of our systems, you have to rebuild everything. It's a pretty elaborate situation. So the rule of thumb is whoever applies the force first essentially does the blue team form, and it can also list in there the secondary use of force. So in instance, if Officer Casper was the first to spray mace, and I don't remember who was, anybody that sprayed mace after that wouldn't have to do a full blue team. Officer Casper would just mention it in his blue team, as he would have my use of force in the holding cell.
And so there was a blue team prepared,
Yes, there was.
and you also prepared a police report because you used force.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And let's talk about this issue of your impressions of Mr. Baker versus the application of force. Because somebody is going to think to themselves, well, gosh, if this guy's such a, has the potential to be such a problem, why would you go in at all?
Well, first of all, that's our job, and that's our policy and procedures at the time. That's the same way that everybody goes to work and turns on their computer or turns on the lights of the building or whatever. That's part of the police officer's job, and sometimes it is dangerous, but we certainly have to do it. I mean, it's an unfortunate side of law enforcement to use force or to put yourself in harm's way, but it is certainly goes with the territory.
And you understood at the time that the expectation from your superiors was that Mr. Baker was going to go on the ring. Under those circumstances, that guy, that prisoner, that person doing that person goes on the ring.
Not only have I done it in the past, I've seen it done several times by other officers and supervisors.
But despite your concerns about Mr. Baker's past and his abilities, you understood that your responsibility was to go in and put him on the ring.
That's correct.
And so, taking into account everything you knew about him, everything you believed about him, everything you knew about what had already happened that night, in your mind, first thing would be a leg sweep. No, not enough room. So, instead, I'm going to push him over as fast as I can.
That's correct.
Okay. And all that happens like that, doesn't it?
Yes, I believe in the criminal portion of this, it was summed up as being somewhere around 12 seconds from the point that I opened the door to confront him for the last time till the point of the push, I believe.
And you were acquitted of a criminal charge, weren't you?
That is correct.
We heard some talk about this, we heard some talk about
That's a
positional.
characterization of that. It's a different standard here, it has nothing, it's no relevance.
We certainly would agree with you that the criminal charge has nothing to do with this case. We're looking at agreements here, administrative policy, not a judicial.
We heard some talk about positional asphyxiation, a concern for positional asphyxiation. Do you know what that is?
I've heard the term as it relates to tasers before. I have never heard of that in correlation with mace before, ever.
And it's when somebody's hands are handcuffed to their feet, right?
That's generally, they refer to it more as a hog tying. That's been a big deal over the years, but it's certainly more of the hog tie, trussed up situation where somebody is laying face down, their hands are cuffed behind their back, and then their feet are tied up to basically meet them behind them. I don't know if I made myself clear on that or not, but that's where I've heard the term positional asphyxiation before. A lot of times also, that's in the back of patrol cars where there's maybe the softness of the seat creates a bigger U for the person's midsection to bend, if you will, and so it makes it harder for them to breathe, basically.
And when you observed Mr. Baker, did you see him even capable of achieving that sort of position where his feet were handcuffed or tied up to his hands?
No.
And so it was not a concern of yours as far as a medical probability, right?
No, and right along with that, I would say the way that he was still arguing and threatening led me to believe that he was coherent enough to make those statements and certainly never stopped making them. So I did not think he was in any medical distress whatsoever.
Now, we also heard some talk about this disciplinary history of yours, which apparently wasn't serious enough to avoid you being promoted to the K-9 division a year before this incident, correct?
That is correct.
Rob, is there anything else you feel like you want to tell the board?
I would just say that on that particular day, I followed all policies and procedures, and I certainly have heard a lot of semantics about the terminology used by IA, and I can only tell you that they cleared me, that it's not an easy process ever to get through the IA. Nobody hates a dirty cop worse than a good cop, and I can tell you that if I thought I was participating in a review that was skewed, I wouldn't be happy about it. And those people are very professional, and that was a good review and a good depiction of the entire facts. It was done over a month's time. It's about 4 inches thick and very, very detailed. It's not one person's opinion from looking at a 10-second video.
I don't have any further questions.
I'll bet you have a question or two.
Just a few.
Why don't we take a break before we do that? We've had this now for about 2.5 hours and I'm going to take a break. We'll come back in 15 minutes again, so it's 10 after 4.